A box sealed in 1987 contained hospital records from 2031. The handwriting belonged to a doctor who died in 1992. Every patient listed inside doesn't exist yet, and the disease they describe has no name in any medical journal. Before we go further, subscribe now, because some American mysteries are too strange to forget. Jackson, Tennessee sits quiet in the western part of the state, where cotton fields stretch toward the horizon and old brick buildings line the streets downtown. It's the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors, where history moves slow, and where the past feels like it never really left. The Madison County Courthouse stands tall in the center, watching over a town that's seen wars, floods, and decades of steady, unremarkable life. In the summer of 2019, a demolition crew arrived at the old Jackson Memorial Hospital on Highland Avenue, a building that had been abandoned since 2003. The hospital had served the community for nearly 70 years before budget cuts and newer facilities made it obsolete. Now it was just another relic waiting to be erased. The crew started on the third floor, tearing through walls and pulling up floorboards that hadn't been touched in over 15 years. Dust filled the air, thick and ancient, as they worked through rooms that once held patients, nurses, and the rhythm of small-town medicine. In the corner of what used to be the records room, beneath a section of collapsed ceiling tiles, they found a metal box. It was about the size of a briefcase, locked with a rusted padlock and covered in a layer of grime that suggested it had been hidden there for a very long time. The foreman pried it open with a crowbar, expecting old invoices or forgotten hospital paperwork. What he found instead made him stop breathing for a moment. Inside the box were medical files, dozens of them, each one neatly organized in manila folders with typed labels on the tabs. The paper was crisp, almost new, as if it had been printed recently despite the box's obvious age. Each file contained patient intake forms, diagnostic notes, treatment records, and physician signatures. But the dates on every single document read between March and July of 2031. Not 1931, 2031. 12 years into a future that hadn't happened yet. The foreman flipped through the pages, his hands shaking slightly, reading names of patients he'd never heard of and symptoms that seemed both familiar and deeply wrong. The first file belonged to someone named Aaron Pritchett, age 42, admitted on March 8, 2031 with what the notes described as acute respiratory collapse with dermal necrosis. The attending physician had written in careful cursive that the patient presented with black lesions spreading from the fingertips up both arms, accompanied by a fever of 104 degrees and violent coughing fits that produced a dark, oil-like substance. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate, as if the doctor had been writing quickly under pressure. At the bottom of the page, a signature, Dr. Raymond Collier. The foreman knew that name. Raymond Collier had been a beloved family physician in Jackson for 30 years. He'd delivered half the babies in town and treated everyone from farmers to factory workers. He'd also been dead since 1992. The crew stood in silence as the foreman read more files aloud, each one describing patients with the same constellation of symptoms. A woman named Sarah Dunlap admitted March 12, 2031, with identical black lesions and respiratory failure. A teenager named Marcus Webb, brought in by his mother on March 15th, already unconscious, his skin marked with spreading darkness. Every file mentioned the same progression. It started in the hands, moved up the arms, then across the chest and neck. Within 72 hours, the patients couldn't breathe. Within 5 days, most of them were dead. The notes described quarantine protocols, failed treatments, and a growing sense of panic among the medical staff. One entry, dated April 2, 2031, simply read, "We've lost count. The morgue is full. We're running out of time." But that was only the beginning. The box also contained a map of Jackson, hand-drawn on what looked like standard printer paper, with red X marks scattered across various locations throughout the town. Each X had a date written next to it, all from March 2031, and a number. The numbers ranged from 3 to 18. At the bottom of the map, in the same shaky handwriting, someone had written, "Initial exposure sites. Avoid all contact. No known cure." The foreman recognized several of the marked locations: the old cotton mill on Airways Boulevard, the water treatment plant off Hollywood Drive, the First Baptist Church on North Highland, places that still existed, places people visited every day. He felt a chill move through him that had nothing to do with the February cold seeping through the broken windows. One of the younger workers suggested it was some kind of joke, maybe a prop left behind from a film student's project or a creative writing exercise. But the paper quality, the precise medical terminology, the consistency of the handwriting across dozens of documents, none of it felt like fiction. The foreman made copies of several files on his phone and called the Madison County Historical Society. By that evening, a small group had gathered in the records room of the half-demolished hospital. The county archivist, a retired doctor who'd worked at Jackson Memorial in the 1980s, and a local historian who specialized in Tennessee medical history. They spread the documents across a makeshift table and began to examine them under the dim work lights the crew had set up. The retired doctor, a man named Eugene Bartholomew, picked up one of the files and studied it carefully through his reading glasses. His face went pale. He recognized the intake forms, the layout, even the specific codes used for patient classification. They matched the system Jackson Memorial had used from 1985 until 1995, a system that was unique to this hospital and had been abandoned when they switched to digital records. No one outside of the staff who'd worked there would know those details. Dr. Bartholomew pointed to a section on one of the forms, a small box in the upper right corner with a 7-digit reference number. That numbering system, he explained, was something Dr. Raymond Collier himself had invented. It was never officially adopted, but Collier had used it personally for years. Only someone with access to Collier's actual files would know it existed. The archivist cross-referenced the signature on the documents with samples of Dr. Collier's handwriting held in the county archives. She laid them side by side under the light. The loops, the slant, the way he crossed his T's and curved his R's. They matched perfectly. This was either Raymond Collier's handwriting or someone had studied it obsessively and replicated it with impossible precision. But Raymond Collier had died of a heart attack in his office on a Tuesday afternoon in August of 1992. He was 64 years old. His funeral had been attended by nearly 300 people. His obituary had run in the Jackson Sun. There was no question he was gone. Yet here, in these documents dated nearly 40 years after his death, was his unmistakable signature. The historian began researching the names listed in the patient files, searching for any record of Aaron Pritchett, Sarah Dunlap, Marcus Webb, or any of the other 24 people described in the documents. She checked birth records, property deeds, marriage licenses, school enrollments, anything that might prove these people existed in Jackson, Tennessee. She found nothing. Not a single name matched anyone currently living in Madison County. She expanded her search to the entire state, then to surrounding states. Still nothing. These people, according to every official record she could access, had never been born. They were ghosts from a future that hadn't arrived yet. One file stood out from the rest. It belonged to a girl named Emma Hartfield, age 9, admitted on March 22, 2031. The notes described her as frightened, confused, asking repeatedly for her mother who had already been moved to the isolation ward. The doctor had written that Emma's left hand was completely blackened, the skin hard and cracked like charred wood. She couldn't move her fingers. The disease was progressing faster in children, the notes explained, their smaller bodies unable to fight whatever this was. At the bottom of Emma's file, someone had paperclipped a Polaroid photograph. It showed a young girl with dark hair and wide eyes, sitting up in a hospital bed, her left hand wrapped in gauze. On the back of the photo in blue ink, Emma, day 4, last photo before quarantine lockdown. The group stared at the photograph for a long time. The girl looked real. The hospital room looked real. The fear in her eyes looked real. But the photo, like the documents, shouldn't exist. Polaroid had discontinued production of this specific film type in 2008. The camera model visible in the reflection of the window behind Emma hadn't been manufactured since 1999. Every detail was slightly wrong, as if someone had tried to recreate 2031 using only tools and knowledge from the past. The historian took the photo and held it up to the light, looking for signs of digital manipulation or forgery. The image was genuine Polaroid film, she was certain of it. The chemical fade patterns, the color saturation, the way the edges had yellowed slightly, all consistent with authentic instant photography. This wasn't a printout or a reproduction. This was an original. Subscribe now because what comes next changes everything. The county archivist found something else in the box, tucked beneath the files in a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter, typed on the same paper as the medical records, addressed to whoever finds this. The letter was dated October 15, 1987, and it was signed by Dr. Raymond Collier. The archivist read it aloud to the group, her voice steady but quiet in the empty hospital room. The letter began simply, "I don't expect you to believe what I'm about to tell you. I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I'm writing this because someone needs to know, and because I won't be here when it matters." The letter went on to describe an event that Collier claimed happened to him in September of 1987, something he called the longest night of my life. According to the letter, Collier had been working late in his office on the 3rd floor of Jackson Memorial, finishing paperwork after a long shift. It was just past midnight when he heard a sound like thunder, except it came from inside the building. The lights flickered and died, plunging the entire hospital into darkness. Emergency generators kicked in after a few seconds, but something felt wrong. The air was different, heavier, and there was a smell he couldn't identify, metallic and sweet at the same time. He walked into the hallway and found it completely empty. No nurses, no security guards, no patients. The hospital was silent. He called out but got no response. That's when he saw the light coming from the records room. Collier wrote that he approached the records room slowly, his heart pounding in a way that made him worry about his own health. The door was open. Inside, the filing cabinets were all pulled out, and papers were scattered across the floor. But these weren't the hospital's current records. These were files he'd never seen before, with dates that made no sense. He picked one up and started reading. A patient named Aaron Pritchett, admitted March 8, 2031. The details were precise, clinical, terrifying. He read more. Sarah Dunlap, Marcus Webb, dozens of people suffering from something he'd never encountered in 30 years of medicine. A disease that killed quickly and left behind bodies marked with spreading blackness. He spent hours reading, taking notes, trying to understand what he was looking at. The letter described how Collier eventually fell asleep at the desk in the records room, exhausted and overwhelmed. When he woke up, it was morning. The regular hospital staff were moving through the hallways. The lights were on, and everything was normal. The files he'd been reading were gone. The papers scattered on the floor had vanished. He searched the entire room but found nothing. He asked the night shift if they'd seen anything unusual. They looked at him strangely and said the night had been quiet. He considered telling someone what he'd experienced, but he knew how it would sound. A doctor having hallucinations, seeing future medical records in the middle of the night. He'd be forced into psychiatric evaluation or early retirement. So he said nothing. But Collier couldn't forget what he'd seen. According to the letter, he spent the next few weeks trying to recreate the files from memory. He wrote down every name he could remember, every symptom, every date. He drew the map of exposure sites based on notes he'd glimpsed. He even tried to replicate the intake forms using the hospital's current system as a template. He knew it wouldn't be perfect, but he felt compelled to document it somehow. He sealed everything in a metal box and hid it in the records room, behind a section of the ceiling that was scheduled for renovation but never completed. He wrote in the letter that he didn't know if what he'd seen was real or if his mind had betrayed him. But if it was real, if even a fraction of it was real, then someone in the future needed to be warned. The letter ended with a single paragraph that made everyone in that demolished hospital room go completely still. I'm writing this in October of 1987. I saw files dated March through July of 2031. That's 44 years from now. I'll be long gone by then, if I even make it another 5 years with this heart of mine. But if you're reading this, and if the dates are getting close, please pay attention. Watch for the signs, the black lesions, the respiratory failure, the locations marked on the map. I don't know what causes it, I don't know how to stop it. All I know is what I saw. And what I saw was a town dying in ways I couldn't explain. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe this is all just the fever dream of an exhausted old doctor. But maybe it's not. And if it's not, then Jackson needs to be ready. Dr. Eugene Bartholomew set down the letter and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. He'd known Raymond Collier personally. They'd worked together for years before Bartholomew retired. Collier had been brilliant, steady, completely rational. Not the kind of man who had visions or invented elaborate hoaxes. Bartholomew remembered that fall of 1987 clearly. Collier had seemed distracted, maybe a little distant, but nothing that suggested a mental breakdown. If anything, he'd been more focused than usual, working longer hours, taking detailed notes on cases that didn't seem particularly complex. Now, 32 years later, those notes made a different kind of sense. Collier had been trying to remember, trying to capture something he'd seen but couldn't prove. The group decided to keep the discovery quiet while they investigated further. They couldn't go public with documents describing a future epidemic without causing panic, especially when they had no way to verify if any of it was real. The archivist locked the box in the climate-controlled vault at the Historical Society. The historian continued researching, looking for any other records that might corroborate Collier's story. Dr. Bartholomew reached out to colleagues in epidemiology and infectious disease, carefully describing the symptoms without mentioning the impossible timeline. He wanted to know if this constellation of symptoms, black lesions, respiratory collapse, rapid progression, matched anything in medical literature. The answers he got back were unsettling. Nothing matched exactly, but pieces of it resembled things that shouldn't be combined in a single disease. One epidemiologist mentioned that the dermal necrosis sounded similar to certain fungal infections, except those took weeks or months to progress, not days. Another noted that the respiratory symptoms resembled severe pneumonic plague, but plague didn't cause the kind of tissue death described in the files. A third specialist said the oil-like substance produced during coughing fits reminded him of a rare industrial exposure case from the 1970s, but that patient had worked in a chemical plant, and the exposure had been accidental and isolated. None of them had ever seen or heard of a disease that combined all these elements. One doctor, a woman who'd spent 20 years with the CDC, told Bartholomew bluntly, "What you're describing doesn't exist. If it did, we'd know about it. It would be in every textbook." Months passed. The historian kept digging, expanding her research into local newspapers, old hospital records, county death certificates, anything that might offer a clue. She found something in the Jackson Sun archives from March of 1931, exactly 100 years before the dates in Collier's files. A small article, buried on page 6, described a mysterious illness that had affected several workers at the old cotton mill on Airways Boulevard. 3 men had developed strange black marks on their hands and arms. 2 of them had died within a week. The local doctor at the time couldn't determine the cause. The mill had shut down temporarily for a deep cleaning, and the incident was never mentioned in the paper again. The historian made a copy of the article and compared it to the map Collier had drawn. The cotton mill was one of the X marks. Initial exposure site, the note had said. She kept searching and found another incident, this time from 1961. A small outbreak of unexplained respiratory illness at First Baptist Church during a Wednesday night service. 7 people had been hospitalized. All of them complained of difficulty breathing and a strange metallic taste in their mouths. 3 developed dark discoloration on their hands. 2 died. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but the attending physician had noted in his personal records that the progression was unlike any pneumonia I've encountered. First Baptist Church was another X mark on Collier's map. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Events separated by exactly 30 years, 1931, 1961, and if the pattern held, 1991 would be next. But the historian couldn't find any record of an outbreak in Jackson during 1991. She checked hospital admissions, death certificates, newspaper archives. Nothing. Then she found a reference in the Madison County Emergency Management records. In April of 1991, there had been a brief quarantine order issued for a section of North Highland Avenue near the water treatment plant. The official reason given was a suspected chemical leak. The area had been sealed off for 72 hours while hazmat teams investigated. No leak was ever found. The quarantine was lifted and the incident was marked as a false alarm. But the historian noticed that 3 people had been briefly hospitalized during those 72 hours. All 3 had presented with respiratory symptoms. All 3 had been treated and released within a week. She tracked down one of them, an elderly woman named Dorothy Keene who still lived in Jackson. Dorothy remembered the incident clearly. Dorothy described how she'd been walking past the water treatment plant on her way to the grocery store when she started feeling dizzy. Her hands began to tingle, then burn. By the time she got home, there were small dark spots on her palms. Her daughter had rushed her to the hospital. The doctors had been baffled. They'd run tests, given her antibiotics, kept her under observation. The spots had faded after a few days, and the breathing problems had resolved. The doctors had called it an allergic reaction to something environmental, possibly pesticide drift from nearby farms. But Dorothy had never quite believed that explanation. The spots hadn't looked like hives or rashes. They'd looked like bruises, except darker, almost black, and they'd appeared so suddenly, spreading from her fingertips inward. She'd been lucky, the doctors had told her. Whatever it was, her body had fought it off. The historian asked Dorothy if she remembered the other two people who'd been hospitalized with her. Dorothy nodded. A man named Harold Ross and a teenage boy whose name she couldn't recall. The historian found Harold Ross's death certificate from 1997. Cause of death: heart failure. But attached to his medical history was a note from his physician about a persistent respiratory condition that had started in 1991 and never fully resolved. The teenage boy was harder to track down, but eventually the historian found him. His name was Michael Tierney, and he was living in Memphis now, working as an accountant. When she called him and asked about the 1991 incident, he went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't talk about that. I'm fine now. I don't talk about it." But the real truth comes now. The historian compiled everything into a report: Collier's letter, the patient files, the map, the historical incidents from 1931, 1961, and 1991, the testimonies from survivors. She presented it to the Madison County Board of Health in early 2020. The meeting was closed to the public. The board members listened to her presentation in silence, examining the documents she'd brought. When she finished, the room remained quiet for what felt like a very long time. Finally, the health director spoke. He thanked her for her thoroughness and her concern. He said they would look into it. He also said, very carefully, that releasing this information to the public would cause unnecessary panic about an event that might never happen. The pattern she'd identified was interesting, he said, but patterns can be coincidences. People see what they want to see. The Historical Society was asked, politely but firmly, to keep the documents sealed and to refrain from discussing them publicly. The official position was that Dr. Collier had likely experienced a stress-induced hallucination in 1987 and had created the files as a result. The historical incidents were real but unrelated, probably caused by industrial contamination or agricultural chemicals common in those eras. There was no credible reason to believe an epidemic would occur in 2031. The matter was closed. The historian and the archivist were frustrated but not surprised. They'd expected skepticism. What they hadn't expected was how quickly the story would leak anyway. By summer of 2020, rumors were circulating through Jackson about mysterious documents predicting a future plague. Online forums picked it up. YouTube channels dedicated to unsolved mysteries featured it. The story spread. The box itself remained locked in the Historical Society's vault, but photocopies of the documents had been made, and those copies had been shared. People began visiting the locations marked on Collier's map, taking photos, posting them online. The old cotton mill, abandoned for decades, became a minor tourist attraction. Local teenagers dared each other to spend time inside the water treatment plant fence. First Baptist Church put up a polite sign asking visitors to respect the property and not trespass. The city council issued a statement saying there was no scientific basis for concern and urging residents to ignore unfounded rumors. But the attention didn't fade. If anything, it grew. Jackson, Tennessee, a town that rarely made national news, was suddenly being discussed on paranormal podcasts and conspiracy websites. Dr. Eugene Bartholomew, in the months before his own death in late 2021, gave one interview to a regional newspaper. He was asked if he believed the documents were real. He said he believed Raymond Collier was a good man and a good doctor who wouldn't create a hoax. He believed something had happened to Collier in 1987, something that genuinely disturbed him. Whether that something was supernatural, psychological, or something else entirely, Bartholomew couldn't say. But he did say this: "I've been practicing medicine for 50 years. I've seen things I can't explain. I've seen diseases appear and disappear without reason. I've seen patterns that shouldn't exist. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that we don't know everything. And sometimes the things we don't know are trying to tell us something. Whether we listen is up to us." The archivist continued to maintain the documents, cataloging them properly, preserving them in acid-free folders. She created a digital archive as well, scanning every page at high resolution. She wanted to make sure that if something did happen, if any part of Collier's vision proved accurate, there would be a record. She also noticed something she hadn't seen before. On the back of the map, written in faint pencil, almost invisible, was a single sentence. It starts with the water. She showed it to the historian, who immediately thought of the water treatment plant on North Highland, one of the marked exposure sites, one of the locations where incidents had occurred in 1931, 1961, and 1991. Always the water treatment plant, always within the first week of March. As 2024 turned into 2025, the city of Jackson began quiet preparations. The health department updated its quarantine protocols. The hospital system conducted epidemic response drills, though they didn't specify what kind of epidemic. The water treatment plant underwent a comprehensive inspection and upgrade, the first major overhaul in 15 years. City officials insisted these were routine measures, unrelated to any documents or predictions. But people noticed. Residents started asking questions. Town hall meetings became tense. Some people demanded transparency. Others insisted the whole thing was nonsense and the city was wasting resources. The division created an atmosphere of unease that settled over Jackson like a fog that wouldn't lift. In October of 2025, the Historical Society received an anonymous package. Inside was a videotape, the old VHS format that hadn't been commonly used in decades. There was no return address, no note, just the tape. The archivist found a working VCR and played it. The footage was grainy, time-stamped March 9th, 1987. It showed the interior of Jackson Memorial Hospital, 3rd floor, late at night. The camera was stationary, probably a security camera. The hallway was empty. Then, at 12:47 a.m., according to the timestamp, the lights flickered and went out. When they came back on a few seconds later, there was someone in the hallway. A man in a white coat, Dr. Raymond Collier. He was standing perfectly still, facing the camera, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked into the records room. The camera angle didn't show inside the room, only the hallway. Collier didn't come out. The timestamp ran for another 3 hours. At 3:52 a.m., the lights flickered again. When they stabilized, Collier was gone. The hallway was empty once more. The archivist played the tape multiple times, examining every frame. The footage appeared genuine, consistent with 1987 security camera technology. But Jackson Memorial hadn't had security cameras on the 3rd floor in 1987. The hospital's security system wasn't installed until 1989. She checked the records. There was no official documentation of any cameras in that area during the time period shown. So where had this tape come from? Who had recorded it? And why send it now, 38 years later, just months before the predicted epidemic? The archivist made copies and locked the original in the vault with the documents. She didn't know what else to do. The mystery was deepening instead of resolving. A group of independent researchers, a mix of epidemiologists, historians, and data analysts, formed an unofficial task force to study the Jackson documents. They called themselves the Collier Project. They approached the investigation scientifically, looking for patterns, cross-referencing data, attempting to build a model that might explain what was happening. One member, a statistician from Vanderbilt University, calculated the probability of the 30-year pattern being coincidental. Her conclusion, less than 2% chance. Something was connecting these events. Whether it was environmental, biological, or something else, the pattern was real. Another member, a microbiologist, attempted to identify potential pathogens that could cause the described symptoms. He found 17 candidates, but none of them matched completely. It was as if the disease described in Collier's files was a hybrid of multiple known conditions, combined in a way that shouldn't naturally occur. The task force published their findings in an open-access journal in January 2025. The paper was titled, Temporal Clustering of Anomalous Health Events in Jackson, Tennessee, Analysis and Implications. It was careful, measured, focused on data rather than speculation. But the conclusion was clear. Something unusual had been happening in Jackson for nearly a century, and there was reason to monitor the situation as the next predicted interval approached. The paper received limited mainstream attention, but went viral in certain online communities. Jackson, Tennessee found itself the subject of intense scrutiny from people who believed in everything from time loops to government conspiracies to supernatural phenomena. The town became a destination for amateur investigators and curiosity seekers. As winter turned to spring in 2025, the atmosphere in Jackson grew heavier. People checked the calendar obsessively. March 8, 2031 was still 6 years away, but the pattern had always started in early March. If something was going to happen in the current cycle, it would be soon. The health department set up a monitoring system, asking local doctors to report any unusual respiratory cases or unexplained skin conditions. The hospital increased its supply of isolation equipment. The water treatment plant ran additional tests on supply quality. These preparations were made quietly, without official announcements, but word spread anyway. Some residents left town for a few weeks, visiting relatives in other states. Others stayed, determined to face whatever might come. Most people simply went about their lives, skeptical but watchful. March 1, 2025 arrived cold and clear. Nothing happened. March 2nd, 3rd, 4th passed without incident. The hospital reported normal patient volumes. No unusual symptoms. No mysterious illnesses. By March 7th, some people began to relax. Maybe the whole thing had been a strange coincidence after all. Maybe Dr. Collier had imagined it. Maybe the pattern would finally break. But late in the evening of March 8, 2025, exactly 94 years after the first documented incident, and 6 years before the date in Collier's files, a maintenance worker at the water treatment plant on North Highland Avenue noticed something wrong with one of the filtration tanks. The water inside had turned slightly dark, with an oily sheen on the surface. The color was subtle, barely visible, but it was there. He reported it immediately. Emergency protocols were activated. The water supply from that tank was shut off. Samples were taken and rushed to a laboratory in Nashville for analysis. By midnight, the results came back. The water contained an unknown organic compound, something the lab technicians had never seen before. It wasn't bacterial, wasn't viral, wasn't fungal. It was something else, something with a molecular structure that didn't match anything in their databases. The compound was unstable, breaking down rapidly when exposed to air, which was probably why it had never been detected in previous tests. But in the enclosed environment of the filtration tank, it had concentrated. The health department issued an immediate advisory. Do not use tap water until further notice. Bottled water was distributed to residents. The advisory was presented as purely precautionary, but everyone in Jackson knew what it meant. By March 10th, 3 people had reported unusual symptoms. All 3 lived in houses that received water directly from the affected treatment plant. All 3 had used tap water on the evening of March 8th before the advisory was issued. They described tingling in their hands, difficulty breathing, a metallic taste that wouldn't go away. Dark spots had begun to appear on their palms. They were admitted to Jackson General Hospital and placed in isolation. Medical staff wore full protective equipment. The CDC was notified. By March 12th, 2 more cases had appeared. The spots were spreading. The respiratory symptoms were worsening. Doctors tried every treatment they could think of: antibiotics, antivirals, antifungals, steroids, experimental compounds. Nothing worked. The disease progressed exactly as described in Dr. Collier's files from 1987, as if the files weren't predictions at all, but instructions the disease itself was following. On March 15, 2025, the first patient died. Her name was Jennifer Caldwell, age 37, mother of 2. The black lesions had spread from her hands to her arms across her chest and up her neck. Her lungs had filled with the same dark, oil-like substance described in the documents. She'd been unable to breathe on her own for the last 18 hours of her life. The autopsy revealed tissue death that was total and inexplicable, as if her cells had simply stopped functioning all at once. The pathologist who performed the examination said he'd never seen anything like it. He'd worked for 25 years and had seen every kind of death. But this was different. This was wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. It was as if her body had aged 100 years in less than a week. The CDC arrived in Jackson on March 16th, setting up a command center in the high school gymnasium. They cordoned off the area around the water treatment plant. They interviewed every resident who'd used tap water from the affected tank. They tested soil, air, water, anything that might provide a clue. But the compound that had appeared in the filtration tank was gone. It had broken down completely, leaving no trace. The scientists couldn't isolate it, couldn't study it, couldn't determine where it had come from or how it had formed. It was as if it had never existed, except for the 5 people lying in isolation rooms with black lesions spreading across their skin, struggling to breathe. 2 more died by March 20th. The remaining 3 began to slowly recover, though the doctors couldn't explain why. Their symptoms simply stopped progressing. The lesions faded. Their lungs cleared. They were released from the hospital on March 25th, weak but alive. The outbreak ended as mysteriously as it had begun. By April 1st, no new cases had appeared. The water treatment plant was declared safe after weeks of testing. The CDC completed their investigation and issued a report that was heavy on data and light on conclusions. They confirmed that an unknown organic compound had contaminated the water supply. They confirmed that 5 individuals had developed an unusual illness after exposure. They confirmed that 3 had died, but they couldn't identify the compound, couldn't determine its origin, and couldn't explain why it had appeared exactly when and where the historical pattern suggested it would. The report ended with a recommendation for continued monitoring and upgraded filtration systems. It did not mention Dr. Raymond Collier or the documents sealed in the Historical Society vault. But the people of Jackson remembered, and they knew. The pattern had held. 1931, 1961, 1991, 2025. Every 34 years. No, wait. The historian recalculated. 1931 to 1961 was 30 years. 1961 to 1991 was 30 years. But 1991 to 2025 was 34 years. The interval had changed. She went back to Collier's letter and read it again. He'd seen files from 2031. If the pattern was accelerating, if the intervals were shortening, then 2025 wouldn't be the last occurrence. She did the math. If the pattern continued to accelerate at the same rate, the next incident would be in 2027, then 2028, then every year, then every month. The disease wasn't disappearing. It was learning. It was preparing for something bigger. The archivist found one more document in the box that they'd overlooked initially, tucked into a hidden pocket in the lining. It was a second letter from Dr. Collier, shorter than the first, dated November 3rd, 1987. It read, "I went back to the records room tonight. I had to know if it was real. The files were there again, but different this time. More of them. The dates had changed. It's not 2031 anymore. It's sooner. I don't know how much time there is. I don't know what this is or why I'm the one seeing it. All I know is that it's not just an epidemic, it's a countdown. And when it reaches 0, it won't be 3 deaths or 5 deaths or even 100. It will be all of us. I can't stop it. I can only warn whoever comes after. Look at the water. Watch the dates. And for God's sake, don't ignore the pattern. The pattern is all we have." The historian presented this second letter to the Collier Project Task Force. They recalculated everything, building new models based on the accelerating pattern. Their conclusions were apocalyptic. If the disease continued to evolve, if the intervals continued to shorten, full global saturation would occur within 15 years, maybe less. They prepared to publish their findings, but before they could, the journal that had published their first paper was contacted by federal authorities and asked to retract it. The official reason given was concerns about inciting public panic over unverified data. The task force refused to stay silent. They self-published their research online. Within 48 hours, the websites hosting the data were taken down. The researchers received visits from government officials who asked them, politely but firmly, to cease their investigation. Most of them complied. A few continued working in secret. Jackson, Tennessee tried to return to normal. The quarantine was lifted. The memorial service for the 3 victims was held at First Baptist Church, one of the marked exposure sites. People went back to work, sent their kids to school, tried to forget the fear they'd felt watching neighbors die from something that shouldn't exist. But the town had changed. There was a wariness now, a sense that something fundamental had shifted. People looked at the water differently. They paid attention to patterns. They remembered Dr. Raymond Collier's warning. And in the quiet moments, late at night when the streets were empty, some of them wondered what he'd really seen in 1987, whether he'd looked forward through time and witnessed the end of everything, or whether time itself had reached back to warn him, using the only language it knew, patterns, cycles, and the stubborn insistence of truth no matter how impossible it seemed. The metal box remains in the Historical Society vault, locked and sealed. The documents inside are cataloged, preserved, waiting. The map with its red X mark still shows the exposure sites scattered across Jackson. The patient files, typed with dates that are now just 6 years away, sit in their manila folders. Emma Hartfield's photograph, the 9-year-old girl with dark hair and frightened eyes, lies among them. She doesn't exist yet. But if the pattern holds, if the disease continues its countdown, she will. In March 2031, 6 years from now, a girl named Emma will be born, will grow up in Jackson, Tennessee, will celebrate 9 birthdays. And on her 9th year in the early spring, she'll wake up with pain in her left hand. Dark spots will appear on her fingers. Her mother will rush her to the hospital, and the disease will take her, just like the documents say it will, just like Dr. Collier saw it happen 44 years before it occurs, unless someone stops it, unless the pattern can be broken, unless the warnings were meant to change the future, not just predict it. That's what keeps the archivist awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the box in the vault and the impossible choice it represents. Do you believe the future is fixed, written in files that shouldn't exist, signed by a dead doctor who saw tomorrow? Or do you believe that some mysteries are meant to be solved, that patterns exist not to terrify us, but to guide us toward prevention? The archivist doesn't know. Nobody knows. All they have is the countdown that dates the pattern that has held for nearly a century, and the growing certainty that 2031 is not an end point, but an acceleration point, the moment when whatever has been stirring in the water of Jackson, Tennessee, finally becomes unstoppable. The last entry in Dr. Collier's files, the one dated July 30th, 2031, describes a hospital that has run out of beds, a morgue that has run out of space, and a staff that has run out of hope. The final patient listed is a woman named Grace Collier, age 44. The notes say she was the last admission before the hospital ceased operations. The signature at the bottom is different from the others, shakier, barely legible, but it's still Raymond Collier's handwriting. And next to Grace's name, someone has written in the margin, "My granddaughter. I couldn't save her. I couldn't save any of them. I tried to warn them. I tried." Raymond Collier had no children. He never married. He died alone in 1992. Grace Collier cannot exist. Yet there she is, typed onto a form that shouldn't be possible, mourned by a man who died 40 years too early to meet her, in a future that's racing toward the present faster than anyone wants to believe. The truth is this: Jackson, Tennessee sits quiet, waiting, the way it always has. The cotton fields stretch toward the horizon. The old brick buildings stand in rows. The Madison County Courthouse watches over everything. But beneath the surface, in the water, in the soil, in the space between what was and what will be, something is counting down. The people who live there can feel it, even if they can't name it. And every March, when the calendar turns and the days grow longer, they hold their breath just a little. They check their hands for dark spots. They listen to their breathing. They wonder if this will be the year the pattern completes itself. If this will be the year Dr. Collier's vision becomes undeniable reality. If this will be the year Jackson, Tennessee becomes the town that proved time isn't as linear as we'd like to believe, and that some warnings come from places we can't reach, delivered by people we can't save, about futures we can't escape. The documents are real. The pattern is real. The disease came exactly when the pattern said it would, killed exactly the way the files described. 2027 is less than 2 years away. If the acceleration continues, the next incident will be smaller in interval but larger in scope. Then 2028. Then 2029. Each cycle bringing it closer, making it stronger, until the year marked in those files arrives and whatever has been building for a century finally breaks through completely. Dr. Raymond Collier tried to warn us from 1987. He sealed his warning in a box and hid it in a hospital that would stand for another 16 years. He signed his name to documents describing his own impossible future. He drew a map of death that has proven accurate again and again. The question is not whether his vision was real. The evidence has answered that. The question is whether anyone with the power to act will believe it before it's too late. And now you know what they found in Jackson, Tennessee. Now you know why some boxes should never be opened, and why some warnings come too early to be believed and too late to matter. The countdown continues. The pattern holds. And somewhere in the future, a doctor who died 33 years ago is still trying to save a town that refuses to listen, using the only tool he has: truth written in files that defy every law we thought governed reality. Some mysteries don't end when the truth is found. They only become more terrifying because you realize the truth was trying to save you all along. So subscribe to this channel, and don't miss what happens when 2031 finally arrives.